It is the centrists who swear by European values, who actually trash European values in the most blatant of ways.
Why are they endlessly talking about Ukraine and Russia? The EU has no business in war.
Through the actions of our own elected leaders, here in Europe, we have become willing extras in the theater of our own diminishment.
A lot of the discussions we see on social media and politics on Ukraine lives in a value space that is totally separate from the world of realpolitik. The hypocrisy is just unbearable.
It's madness. Europe is putting the cart before the horse. We decide how much to spend and then struggle to spend it. It's a guarantee that it will be spent terribly.
So at the end of this military expansion exercise, we will be even more part of the United States system because the only way we can actually get to 3.5% is to buy US defense goods.
Every time I hear the words European Union, Wolfgang, I'm reminded of what Mahatma Gandhi once said when asked what his views were on British civilization. He said it would be a great idea. Similarly, I think the European Union would be a great idea, but we're nowhere near having one.
Hello and welcome back to the Econoclasts. I'm Wolfgang Munchau, and it's good to see you, Yanis.
It's very good to see you too, Wolfgang. I was wondering what the orthodoxy that you are going to take your aim towards is going to be today.
Well, today I will be talking about the orthodoxy that we European countries have to spend 3.5% of our GDP on defense. I will argue that they got it the wrong way around.
Today, I'm going to be training my slings and arrows on the orthodoxy, actually the monstrous lie, that Europe is guided by European values. I wish it were, but I'm going to be arguing that it is not. Now, as we all know, Wolfgang, every speech in Brussels, every school text on the European Union, they are replete with triumphant proclamations of how European values are the European Union's foundation stone. This is the phony orthodoxy that I want to blast out of the water today. And I shall do it not in abstract terms, but with a very down-to-earth, concrete example. It's the example of a French judge. What I'm about to tell you, folks, is a true story unfolding right now as we speak. Judge Nicolas Guillou, a French citizen, a French judge of some note, had been appointed by the French state to sit on the bench of an international court, the International Criminal Court, which French and European diplomacy went to great lengths to establish. Why did we establish it? To turn a page from a past where war criminals could hide behind their governments. During the execution of his duties, in this case, an investigation of war crimes in Gaza, Judge Guillou, meticulously following the procedures of his court, authorized arrest warrants for senior Hamas functionaries, but also for the Israeli Prime Minister and the former Defense Minister of Israel. And what did the Trump administration do? They sanctioned the good judge. What does this mean in practical terms? It means that Judge Guillou is now a non-person, not only in the United States, but also in his own country, in France, in the beating heart of Europe. That he has been cut off the digital realm, which is American-owned, WhatsApp, Gmail, Google Maps, iPhones, Instagram, all that, is serious, but understandable. What I think is less fathomable is the fact that when this judge tries to book a hotel room in France, his bookings get rejected. Indeed, his French bank account is frozen. So the real tragedy here is not that President Trump is throwing his weight around, or that the Israeli lobby is running amok against anyone who challenges its right, the right of Israel, to commit any war crime of its choosing. Hegemons and bullies, that's what they do, they bully. It's in their nature. The real tragedy, or is it, maybe it's a farce, lies in Europe's reaction. How did Europe respond? Did Europe respond with a unified, thunderous condemnation, with measures to help ameliorate the judge's ordeal, by triggering some kind of retaliatory measure? Did they create European financial and digital channels to protect not just this judge, but, the judiciary, the citizens of Europe from such extraterritorial bullying? No, not a word, not a peep, not even from this great liberal icon, President Emmanuel Macron of France. Now, this is not a unique case, unfortunately. It's just one of many that are symptomatic of Europe's servility. of how readily Europe sacrifices European values on the altar of maintaining its servitude to the White House primarily. At the same time, as if to prove they don't even understand why Trump treats them like vermin, European leaders protest loudly that Washington has sidelined them during this peace process in drawing up a peace deal for Ukraine that you and I, Wolfgang, have discussed this. So explain this to me, Wolfgang. Don't they get it? Are they so blind to see that their complicity to Judge Guillau's treatment by the United States, what it does, it's encourages Trump to treat them with even more contempt.
Well, that's been the experience, that there is no way to get on top of this situation by kowtowing to Trump. I think the deeper issue that you mentioned about European values is, there's the hypocrisy. Whenever we talk about Europe, we always talk about hypocrisy in the end, because Europeans say something, but in the end cannot deliver. They pretend they help Ukraine, but they cannot allocate money for it. They don't have the defense goods that they can send over. So hypocrisy is a very big deal, and I think the values issue is hypocrisy as well. Foreign policy shouldn't be about values, and it's not a moral statement that I'm making. It just doesn't work, because in the end, interests intrude, and here the interest of Europe is Europe has chosen that its relationship with the United States is the most important thing. That is the expressed interest. I would disagree with that choice, but that's the choice they made. They should stop pretending that they have a values-based foreign policy, because they don't. It's always about something else. What isn't working is the fact that they're making these pretenses. All of these things are going out of the International Criminal Court. We're seeing this. There's still this pretense that we can drag Putin in front of the International Criminal Court. That will only happen if he's defeated, which obviously we are not delivering in terms of our support for Ukraine. So ultimately, there's always something else that stops us from doing this. So it would probably be better to say, look, this isn't credible anymore, and what we should be doing is try to start to think about our interests here. I have a very different definition from the existing European interest. Europe has chosen to be weak. It's chosen not to have a strong euro. It's chosen not to have a single economic policy. It's chosen not to have a single defense policy. These are choices, and they're choices made because people thought they were realistic. This is sort of another sort of European delusion, that they are sort of that they cannot realistically do all these things, and therefore we are living in some kind of pretense land. And this is one of the reasons why the EU is lacking credibility. So I think this is sort of part of a broader story.
I agree entirely, but I'd go a bit further. You see, this hypocrisy is detrimental to the language and the calculus of interests as well. Because it's not the Le Pens and the Alternative for Deutschlands and the Melonis and the Orbans that trash European Enlightenment values. At least, these ultra-rightists never espouse these values. They think that these values are for sissies. It is the centrists who swear by European values, who actually trash European values in the most blatant of ways. Now, you say that we should be looking after our interests and forget about the grand narratives of the Enlightenment. Well, I beg to differ to some extent, because I seriously believe deeply in these European values, in the Enlightenment and the modernity values that Europe proclaims. And it would be in our interest to actually pursue these values in a way which is consistent with our interests. And I do believe that these two go together. The fact that the European political establishment is trashing its own values goes hand in hand with the manner in which they just ignore our interests. So in the same way that they sit idly by watching this particular French judge being depersoned by Donald Trump, in exactly the same way they are contributing to their own annihilation as political entities when, for instance, they're refusing to consider a peace plan for the Ukraine. For 3 years now, 3.5 years, the European establishment's line has been that there should be no peace process, while at the same time having no plan of how to win the war. The two go together, don't you think?
The issue with the values-based policy is, you can have your own value. Everyone, every country, Europe can have its value-based policies. The problem arises when you get weaker, as Europe has, both economically and politically, and you're trying to impose your values on others. This happened, for example, through regulation. We're imposing our regulation on importers. We impose our values on China. We accuse China of violation of human rights, and we tie trade agreements with this. Every European, one of the reasons Europe has difficulty these days striking trade agreements is because the Europeans always need to put value stuff into this great agreement. That's why the trade agreement with India, which was supposed to be ready this month, not going to be ready this month. This is the reason why it's stagnating, because the Indians say, no, you don't talk to us about what, how we conduct our own business. We are trying to impose values on people who are far bigger than us and who no longer look up to us. And I think that is the difference. There was a time when the Chinese were, looking up to us, and they looked, Europe was the center of the world. The Europeans still think they are. That is no longer the case. And this is why this policy, this is sort of it's kind of a colonial thing. We think, there's an awful lot of Enlightenment thinking in our colonialism. There was the positive aspect of it, positive, so to speak, that we are exporting our values. It's wrong. It's basically no longer a functioning policy. So I think the problem is, a values-based foreign policy. We tried this. We've had this in Germany, where where it went from a very business-first type foreign policy to a values-based foreign policy, and it failed. And it failed for the hypocrisy that you just mentioned. We support Ukraine because it's our value. What Putin violates our values. So we stick with Ukraine, but we haven't got the capacity or the political willingness to actually get the job done. So we treat the values. So we live in a value space, basically. A lot of the discussions we see on social media, in politics on Ukraine, lives in a value space that is totally separate from the world of realpolitik. I've yet to meet a Ukraine supporter in the UK or in Germany who actually tells us what it would take to actually inflict a defeat on Putin in terms of funding, in terms of military, in terms of political support. It's just not there. They just avoid the subject because they're seeking refuge to the very comforting value space.
Well, I'd like to take issue with your point that we are simply trying hypocritically to impose values on others. No. It's worse than that. We are pretending we are imposing those values upon ourselves when we're not even doing that. You just brought to my mind, that terrible memory of hours of negotiating with the European Union when I was in the ministry 10 years ago over milk. Now, what they were trying to force, one of the many things they were trying to force down our throat, was that we should remove an obligation by sellers of milk to specify when the milk was bottled, when it was sold as fresh milk. And the only reason they did that was because they wanted to be able to sell Dutch milk from Holland in Greece, without having to state that it was milk, a month ago. And they wanted to sell it as fresh. So, that really does not sync with the idea of freedom of information, of allowing customers to know what it is that they are buying. I can think of many such examples. So if it was simply a question of us trying to impose values that we live by upon the Indians and the Chinese, this could be a different conversation. Here I'm talking about values that are not being imposed upon ourselves. Let me remind you that a year and a half ago, I was banned from entering Germany, even by Zoom, because I had the audacity, along with my colleagues of Team 25, the movement I belong to organize in Berlin a conference with German Jews and Palestinians on the very incendiary topic of a just peace in the Middle East. And I'm still fighting a court case against the German authorities. So, I've got some skin in the game. Where are the European values in all of this?
When it comes to Israel, it's going to be difficult for the Europeans, for the Germans. There have been some absolutely absurdities that happened in Germany during the war. For Germany, this has been a very, very difficult time. The broader issue about values, one of the reasons we are in so much difficulty in Europe is that this sort of juxtaposition of what we pretend to be our values and the reality that you described. You described a very extreme case. We are sort of living in this space where our values and our actions do not correspond. And this is why, and this is caused by the EU going way beyond what it should have done. The single market, we we probably agree that this was itself a good project, but it was never completed. It was only a very partial project. It still has a lot of barriers. Having abandoned the single market, they've started a single currency. They've kind of abandoned that project as well because they have not created a political union that's on top of it. They have started a Green Deal, which was in many ways a good idea had it been pursued intelligently and persistently. They're now giving up on it. But the EU is a case of attention deficit politics. In the middle of all this, we're trying to impose values. It is no surprise that we are inconsistent because we don't have a common purpose. I mean, why is Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas, why are they endlessly talking about Ukraine and Russia? The EU has no business in war. It says explicitly in the European treaties that defense is outside the remit of the EU, outside the remit of the single market. Why do they endlessly talk about this? This is the EU trying to portray itself as a global player. This is, people wanting to be at the G7, the G20, and, having global influence rather than doing the job. And I think that is, to me, when people talk about values, to me, that is when they should have been talking. The EU should be really, talk about the single market, why growth is falling, why, what are the barriers to growth. And that's the kind of stuff they should be talking about rather than about grand issues of foreign policies. And trade deals should be about, mutual advantage of the countries that participate in it. It shouldn't be about our values. And this is why we're getting into a constant mess. And yeah, I completely agree with you. The hypocrisy is just unbearable.
So, folks, this is the orthodoxy that I wanted to take aim at today. The idea that European values are the heart of European policy. They are not. Whenever and wherever a European value is proclaimed, when you actually scratch the surface, it's not there. It has already been violated by the people who proclaimed it, whether it's central bank independence of the European Central Bank, or as Wolfgang just said, the single market, the idea of a common currency, which is not exactly common, the way that it has been devised with 20 different banking systems and only even, the concept of the banking union being yet another hypocritical concept, if you look at the way things are panning out. I do think that this example of the French judge, is so blatant. It really brings out this hypocrisy. And it shows how, through the actions of our own elected leaders here in Europe, we have become willing extras in the theater of our own diminishment. And the most pathetic part is that we don't even seem to realize that it is Europe's finest that brought this diminishment about.
After the break, I will be discussing why it is a fallacy to think that we need to spend 3.5% of our GDP on defense.
So don't go anywhere.
So welcome back. I'm going to debunk the popular thesis that we need to spend 3.5% of our gross domestic product on defense and add another 1.5% on defense infrastructure. That makes 5%. The argument that I'm making is that it is the wrong way around. You need to first identify what you want to spend the money on and then allocate the financial resources. And this is not a budgetary issue. This is a very fundamental issue because it leads to dramatically different outcomes. It is the difference between, losing a war or winning a war. Now, this debate is not about whether it's the right thing to increase defense spending. This is an important debate, but it's a different debate. This is about how we should think about the capabilities. In our first discussion, we spoke about Europe's hypocrisy and Europe's dependency on the United States, that we give up our own values, but also our own security, in my case, in exchange for our subservience for our relationship with the United States. And this is the same here in defense, because the 5% spending target for defense came from Trump, came to power and said he would only stay engaged in NATO if the EU were to spend 5%. During his first term, it was 2%, and some countries like Germany and Italy and Spain refused to actually abide by the 2% spending target, even though they themselves committed to it. And now Trump upped the ante to 5%, but this time they took him seriously, and this time they said they would follow it. Now, the problem with a target like this, it is the way how a target like this interacts with the way the EU works. In Europe, defense spending is not part of the single market, so every country has its own defense procurement operation. So the Germans buy the defense goods for the German army, the French buy the French goods, the military goods for the French army. There is some cooperation for some weapon systems, but broadly the Europeans are, each on their own. If you do 3.5% for military spending, and most countries spend less than the average in the EU is less than 2% right now, all that will happen is that they will spend more money, but they will not spend it more efficiently. And efficiency is by far the biggest problem. For example, there are some shocking statistics. For example, the cost of bullets of ammunition in Russia is a fifth of the costs of ammunition produced by Germany. The reason for this discrepancy is the fact that we Europeans are all each on their own, each producing small scale. We cannot agree to coordinate our programs. If you speak to the military guys at the Bundeswehr, you may actually think that the French are the biggest enemy, not the Russians, because there is a deep amount of suspicion about the Europeans. The defense spending target enhances that. What the effect of it will be is that it will deepen our dependency on the United States rather than do the opposite. I think the original idea of bolstering our defense was to actually become independent. It was called strategic autonomy. There's none of that. The way we're organizing this right now is we're actually increasing our dependence on the United States. So at the end of this, military expansion exercise, we will be even more part of the United States system, because the only way we can actually get to 3.5% is to buy US defense goods. This is all to do with the way we set targets. Now, there's a more general thing about, the way we target things, whether it's school league tables or competitiveness league tables. We basically follow some false metrics. The Germans think they're competitive because they are high in the competitiveness index, only to realize that their GDP is stagnating, because until recently the Germans believed they were the world's greatest innovators because they had the most patents. Yeah, but to have a patent on a doorknob on a car, for example, is not exactly something that brings you a lot of money. Whereas China is developing software, stuff that usually isn't patented. I think on the defense spending side here it is what we want. And then we find the money for what it needs. That is the sane approach. This is another way for the EU to fail, and that's why I think the 3.5% target is hopping mad.
Well, your point on the inefficiency of military spending in Europe is, of course, spot on. It's madness. Europe is putting the cart before the horse. We decide how much to spend and then struggle to spend it. It's a guarantee that it will be spent terribly badly. Actually, Wolfgang, reminds me, do you remember that movie of 1980s, Brewster's Millions, in which the protagonist must spend a large sum of money in a short space of time to receive an even larger inheritance? For Hollywood, it was a great little cinematic device, but for Europe, it is policy. It's madness in action. But then there is, of course, the second issue. Will this increase the 3.5% or 5% limit, even if it is reached, help Europe return to growth? In other words, is this an efficient military Keynesianism? It's not. As we know, Keynesian pump priming works in closed economies, where there are no leakages, where the government spending does not translate into greater imports. But here, as you said, most of the money will be sent to the United States of America for weaponry. So Europe's military Keynesianism does not leak. It resembles a Titanic, a ship with a hole in its hull larger than that the famous iceberg opened up on the Titanic.
There is actually an opportunity here. I mean, one of the, we know, and we've been talking about this before, that Europe is sort of lagging the Americans and the Chinese in technology and in innovation. And that would have been actually an opportunity for the Europeans to pool money to create new technologies, to create their own weapon systems. They missed that opportunity because now they're buying all these things they need from the United States. And the reason they have to buy this from the United States is because they don't have the capability, because the way wars are fought are changing fast. We see this in Ukraine, the use of drones by both sides. Even the drones are developing completely out of recognition. The drones used today are completely different from the drones used a year or 2 years ago. we are basically in a sort of an innovation race that the Europeans haven't even started to develop. I mean, you can easily reach your 5% defense spending target by giving 5% of your GDP to the shareholders of Rheinmetall. Then you can tick off that you've reached the target. You haven't done any military. This is not military Keynesianism. I'm actually open to the idea of military Keynesianism if you manage to create some spillovers to the economy. If you created even an industry that is successful in its own right, even without spillovers, that would be very good. I mean, look what the Americans did. If you look at the history of American innovation, it was heavily influenced by the military. It was the military that sponsored this sort of the silicon development, the transistor, the integrated circuit. They bought all these technologies and integrated them into their military gear. Without the initial support of the military, there wouldn't have been an internet. It was only later that the private sector took over and is now the main source of investment. The military is no longer the driving force. It's basically a user of the material, but it's no longer the inventor or no longer the co-sponsor of this. We Europeans should have probably thought more about this sort of 1950s, 1960s, all the DARPA, all the things. I mean, we would have done this differently. But the way we're doing it, this each on their own, is an absolute disaster because, here's the largest country, Germany, now having a target, which is another stupid target, having the largest army in Europe, which I think is as stupid as a target. If you were sort of minded of, defending and you wanted a really strong defense, you wouldn't use metrics like that. You would say, we need the capabilities to withstand this and this and this type of attack, like cyber attacks. What do we have? Like ground attacks, like air attacks, like nuclear attacks. What are our capabilities? That's the kind of intelligent strategic planning. We Europeans don't need to fight two wars at the same time. We don't need to be an army the size of the United States. We have a very different setup. We are much more focused on military conflicts that happen on our borders. We don't need to fight in Africa or in Asia. This calls for a much more focused and smarter approach than this sort of across-the-board 5% of GDP, which is absolutely not going to happen. And the final sort of thing here is that when Putin did this, he spends about 6 to 7% of his GDP on the military. He didn't care about whether it's 6 or 6. It's Western people who did the math on this. I don't think it was ever a variable in Russian military planning what the percent of GDP is. It was a residual. It was something, the outcome of some process. It was not the process.
Well, military Keynesianism, as you said, was the backbone of American industrial policy, and it worked. And it's been working for Putin as well since 2022. But here is a slight disagreement that you and I have. Firstly, I don't think military Keynesianism is possible in Europe. And secondly, it's not desirable. And let me explain. Firstly, why is it not feasible? Because to succeed as a military Keynesian power, you need a common safe liquid bond like American treasuries. We don't have them. We need a common Pentagon equivalent. We don't have it. And there is not even a discussion to get them. The reason why I don't think it's desirable is that even if you manage to construct all that, like the Americans did, you need to have a war in regular intervals, as America has been doing since the Korean War, to clear the stock of weaponry in order to reproduce the aggregate demand that is necessary in order to keep the military Keynesianism going. But before you tell me where you disagree on that, I want to perhaps be a bit more controversial and say something about your country, because I'm worried about Germany, Wolfgang. It seems to me that Germany's political establishment seems to be in utter disarray. They are haunted by the specter of losing the war in Ukraine. They have already actively supported what's been happening in Gaza. I call it a genocide. It's now spreading in the West Bank. They are burdened with a second incompetent government in a row, with a large segment of the German population being stressed by austerity, deindustrialization, with a decline of the one thing that gave Germans a sense of great pride, industrial pride, that is the car industry. Most Germans are trying to be good, decent Europeans in a society where Islamophobia is running riot. It is just the tip of a xenophobic iceberg. And I do think that in this environment, the zeitgeist is increasingly drawn to fear and loathing. And we have seen this before. one does not need to be a great social theorist or psychologist to know that if you throw in this mix a combination of massive military spending, this talk, as you mentioned, the largest army in Europe and so on, at the expense of social services, against the background of stagnation, German society is not going to end up where most Germans want it to be, where German society deserves to be.
I agree. I just wrote a book about about the decline of the German industry, and one of the things I always note is whenever I speak in Germany and speak to Germans, at the end of the discussion, there's always somebody who says, "Oh, can you not give us some good news?" And I always say to them, "Yeah, you like a good sort of good night story from me, but I'm not going to give you a good night story, because the good news is there is too much complacency, and if you have a soothing optimistic outlook, you're going to be complacent, and and this continues, and one of the reasons people are in this mess when faced with such a sort of broad economic but also social decline is that this takes a long time, and people don't realize that the kind of crisis they had. I mean, if this had happened quicker, I mean, the classics of boiling frog syndrome. If that happened quicker, they would have probably been much more alarmed. But they've kind of gotten used to this issue, and they kind of build up narratives to defend it. And it's sort of now we get value arguments that degrowth is fantastic and that this is part of who we are, and all this nonsense. Let's just speak about the one disagreement that we do have about the feasibility of military Keynesianism in Europe. Virtually all the things we discuss about Europe, nothing much works because we don't have a fiscal and capital markets union. Without the capital, the banks don't deliver these outcomes, whether it's military, whether it's innovation in the general sense, new companies, new startup technology. The European banking system is hopeless. That's why we need a capital market, and not a national one, but a European one. I've been saying that forever, and the EU is not interested in this. But it is possible to have military Keynesianism if the EU agreed to do one thing and one thing only, and this is to create a defense procurement union. They can still have separate militaries. You don't need to have a single military. That would indeed not happen, and it's also would require actually treaty changes. But the EU could move towards a central procurement system, or Europe actually could move to a system, because the UK, Norway are not part of the EU, and yet it really makes no sense to exclude the UK from this. And in fact, the EU just excluded the UK from the one little defense procurement initiative they had. There's this little scheme the Commission developed called SAFE, and the French wanted the UK to pay massive contributions of like an EU membership fee in order to take part in it, and the UK said no thank you. Now, that's not the way to go for this. The way to do this is to create maybe within the European group inside NATO, a defense procurement union. It doesn't have to be the EU, and in fact, I would prefer it not to be the EU, and let the EU concentrate on the things it needs to focus on, namely the economy and not defense, and have a separate procurement union that focuses not on existing things. I don't think we should be too ambitious here, but on the next on the 3% stuff, the 3.5% stuff. I mean, we're spending what we're spending now, but let's just have a procurement union for the new stuff, for the tech stuff, for the next generation, the stuff that requires research, that requires new structures. Very hard to go against existing structures. You're not going to get Rheinmetall integrated into a European defense procurement union, but you get the next generation of companies maybe. And that would be a way to do this, but the EU is too timid. The way the thinking goes, for example, in the German military, the thinking goes, they said, we've had bad experience with the French. We have great trust in the Americans. We've had a long history of developing joint weapon system with the Americans, and we want to continue this. And it's still the military leaders in our countries that kind of call the shots on this. It's not, we don't have political leaders that say, no, you're not doing this. No, actually, we tell you what the situation is. So the Europeans are weak in sort of all respects. They follow the Americans politically, but also they also let their own militaries call the shots here. So it is possible, but we probably both agree that's not going to happen. I think that's where we have the agreement. Military Keynesianism isn't going to happen in Europe because we don't have the structures and because we don't have the political will.
Well, just one little vignette here. It would be important, a necessary condition to have common procurement, but it wouldn't be enough. You need also common debt in order to empower military Keynesianism. But as you said, we are not even at the beginning of discussing the necessary condition, which is common procurement. But yet again, how could we? I mean, we don't even have a common energy policy, which, this is what's mind-numbingly ridiculous, that, we have a Europe. Every time I hear the words European Union, Wolfgang, I'm reminded of what Mahatma Gandhi once said when asked what his views were on British civilization. He said it would be a great idea. Similarly, I think the European Union would be a great idea, but we're nowhere near having one.
Yeah, I would actually go further. I think, I think this is probably the most controversial thing that I've ever said. I think the way towards European integration will be through the dismantling of the EU. I don't think there is a way through the EU to European integration. I think the EU is a dead-end road on the way to European integration. So I think in the long run, and I think that's that's longer than our lifetimes. I think European integration will eventually happen. It will eventually become necessary, but we're going to experience a number of breaks and stops on the way. For now, the most likely scenario is for the EU to remain hypocritical, to lose its importance both in national policy making and globally, and for it to remain sort of a shell, because it's not going to collapse on its own because it's it's enshrined in legal systems. It's really quite difficult to actually undo the EU, but it's not the future. So future European integration will need something else, seriousness, and where these things like you talked about energy. Of course, they need an energy policy. They need a real single market, not the one where each country imposes obstacles. A single market basically means that the power that there shouldn't be economics ministries and finance ministries left. That makes no sense. Not the big stuff. Not financial stability. Not economic management or macroeconomic management, and certainly not defense.
Well, we started talking about the 3.5% or 5% spending target from the European Union perspective, and we ended up with wholesale and very radical Wolfgang Munchau resembling or reminding me. The first time I heard this argument that the only way to complete European integration is to do away with the EU, you will be horrified if I tell you who was the person that spoke those words, at least in my presence. It was Jean-Luc Mélenchon.
Well, no, I'm not a follower of Jean-Luc Mélenchon. I didn't actually know that.
I'm not asking you to support Jean-Luc Mélenchon, but what I'm saying is that this is what the EU has come to. It has become so abhorrent in its incompetence and, to a large extent, hypocrisy, that we end up with very interesting coincidences of belief between very, very different people, including you and me. We come from very different political backgrounds, and more often than not, we agree, which is a terrible sign of the awful situation in Europe today.
Yeah, and I think it's what happens when hypocrisy rules, like on defense. I mean, we can have a long argument about whether defense spending is good or bad, but we don't actually need to have that argument because it's futile anyway. And it's sort of, that's basically what this conversation is about. The EU pretending to be a global power, the EU, wagging its fingers to the rest of the world, as we had in our first discussion. The EU, imposing itself, and yet not having the means, the ability, and the consistency to achieve the goal. Because if you actually talk to politicians in Brussels, also national capitals, you don't get a sense of people trying to solve problems. There are not people who, the 3.5% defense spending crowd. They're not really interested in defense spending. They're really interested in meeting their targets. And the idea of what it takes and what defense spending should be in the fast advancing 21st century, we should be having discussion about hybrid warfare. We should be thinking about it very differently than the way these targeted discussions go. So this is for losers, basically, and that's and that may well be the way the EU comes to an end. Maybe not, but people have a very large capacity to delude themselves for very long times.
You remind me of 2008 when the bottom of financial markets was falling at the speed of light. The Americans got together around the table, the chairman of the Fed at the time, Bernanke, the President Bush, later Obama, the bankers, JP Morgan and so on, and they asked themselves a very simple question: how do we get out of this without being totally annihilated by this crisis? When the Europeans got around the same table or a similar table, they asked a different question. How are we going to pretend that we can maintain the rules that are now impossible to maintain in the face of public opinion? These are two different questions. And if you try to answer the second one, you are guaranteed 20 years of stagnation.
And that's what we got.
So, folks, we began our podcast discussing the manner in which Europe violates its own European values with impunity, and we ended up talking about the manner in which we are fooling ourselves into thinking that by raising our defense expenditure we're going to do anything serious about increasing the military capacities of the European Union. This is all for today. See you next week.
Don't forget to rate, like, and subscribe to the Econoclasts.